Just stand so they can see you in the camera there.
Like sit
You
down?
can sit down, you can just stand back here a little bit so they can see. Perfect, right there.
Okay. So how many people are in attendance?
26
26 on there, it looks like,
in
online, and then the rest of the folks here.
Oh, okay. All right, Chief Clowett, good evening. My name is Michael Buck. I've been asked to do land acknowledgement, which is a new protocol here. That's excellent, very excellent. I just showed up. Alumni, really enjoy Spirituality Week. Anyhow, I'll just read off Yakama Nation land acknowledgement.
Michael, maybe you can slip your mask off. It might be hard for them to hear you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is
and
that the
speak
mic
up
right
there.
there?
That's a mic right there. It's picking you up. It just needs to be a little bit more forceful in your, I know once you get started reading, you will.
Okay. Okay, again, my name is Michael Buck, Yakama Nation alumni, 2019. So, Heritage University, Yakumai Tichum, the land of the Yakama people. Land acknowledgement, the full version. Heritage University occupies its home on the traditional lands of the Yakama people. These ancestral homelands are the Yakama, Palouse, Piscois, Winachipum, Klickitat, Tlingit, Kawasai, Liaiwas, Skinpa, Wisham, Shiks, Okotoks, Miltpa, and Siapkat, who today are represented by the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. Treaty of 1855, and whose relationship with this land continues to this day. Heritage University, grounded in the vision of the two Yakama women founders, respects Indigenous peoples as traditional guardians of the lands and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community on this land. We acknowledge that our university's history, like many others, is fundamentally tied to the first colonial developments in the Yakima Valley. Finally, we respectfully acknowledge and honor past, present, and future Indigenous students who will journey through this home called Heritage University. The abridged version, I'll read that. So, the land of the Yakama people. We would like to acknowledge that we're coming to you from the traditional lands of the first people of our valley, the 14 Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Yakama tribe. Just a quick prayer, I guess. I'm glad to see everyone. I truly am glad to see everyone. It was my purpose to be here, so I made time deliberately, even though we had a ceremony earlier this morning, a sweat lodge ceremony, cleansing ceremony, and so I'll just go off of that prayer. So I pray for our homes, that we can withstand the weather, that our bodies can handle the weather, that our mothers and our children can maintain their health each and every day, that the food that we take in and that we share at breakfast and at lunch and at dinner, that we're around supportive people of our lives. We recognize the instruments of faith through this community on the campus here. We recognize friendships and bonds, professional relationships, and we pray that we're able to focus on each task with the clear mind and a clean body. And we want to acknowledge the creator of our different faiths. So with that, just want to say that I'm grateful for everybody's time. They made time to be here, and for everybody that organized the event. Like I said, our friendships and our community here is the homes that we're going back to tonight, the beds that we go back to, that we're all safe, that we don't take any unnecessary risks, that we're able to focus on the things that make us feel good, and that we can share those things continuously through the week. So thank you.
Right. It's my honor now to introduce Christine McCleave, who is the CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Christine.
Oh. Bonjour, Dinaway Magani Duke, Dindisi Indigenacas, Makinak Waju and Dunjiba, Mikizi and Dudame. And what I just said to you in my traditional language of Ojibwe was, greetings, my relatives. My name is Dindisi, which means Blue Jay. I am from Turtle Mountain, North Dakota, and I am Eagle Clan. I'm also the CEO for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Apologies for my nasally voice. I unfortunately have COVID. So I would really strongly encourage all of you in the room there to, continue to be vigilant. I'm double vaccinated, and yet COVID is on the rise around the country right now. So stay safe and, continue to mask up and socially distance. So I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, traditional homelands of the Ojibwe and Dakota peoples, where the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is headquartered. And I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint with you and tell you the story of, looks like I don't have permission to share my screen.
Yeah, you do. Now you do.
Okay, we'll try that again. Great. Thank you. All right. So you all can see the PowerPoint now? Okay, great. So the mission of the Boarding School Healing Coalition, or NABS for short, is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that was created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. We were started in 2012 as a 501c3 nonprofit after years, if not decades, of this grassroots movement. And really what happened was a gathering of boarding school survivors from the US and Canada came together in 2011 and had a symposium and said, we need a commission like they have up in Canada. So they formed this nonprofit, and the Native American Rights Fund became our fiscal sponsor and helped get us off the ground. I started as their first employee in 2015, and I've been with the coalition for 6 years. And so we will be having our 10-year anniversary next year in 2022. And depending on how you look at it, we have been doing this for 10 years, and you could say that's a long time to be, asking for truth and healing, or you could say it's not very long at all, considering that this history we're trying to address is over 150 years of history. So our staff is in Minneapolis, and pictured here, we're a staff of 7, which is amazing to think of how we've grown over the last 6 years from starting as a staff of 1 myself and being able to grow the coalition to what it is today. Our programs are centered around education, advocacy, and healing, which is to say we are pursuing truth, justice, and healing. So if you want to learn more about our programs, you can head to our website at boardingschoolhealing.org. Education is a huge part of what we do, raising the awareness about this history. I mean, prior to 2021 and all the news about boarding schools and residential schools in the US and Canada, not a lot of people were paying attention to this issue. And our pursuit of education was to make the general public in the United States aware that this was a part of the history in this country. And then within Native communities, we were trying to raise awareness so that individuals could know how this history was impacting their lives and their families. And so when we talk about education and awareness, we always start by setting the historical context, which goes all the way back to the doctrine of discovery, if not farther, which is to say that the papal bull that declared that lands could be claimed for the cross and the crown if they weren't being inhabited by Christian peoples really set forth this policy of white supremacy that we are still feeling the effects of today in this country. And recently I wrote an article for Journal of the West called Boarding Schools, What Colonial Empire Has to Do with God. And so really, this sets that into context that, pictured here in this painting called American Progress by John Gast is the angel Columbia moving from east to west. And she's, stringing the electrical lines, and there's a stagecoach, and there's agriculture. And in the background, there's a port town, and there's the railroad, and all these things called American Progress. And she has in her hands a school book, bringing with her knowledge and education. And off to the west, she's chasing away the indigenous people and the buffalo, where the clouds in the background get very dark and ominous. And so this was the idea of American progress, that indigenous people were standing in the way of that westward advancement of American progress. And the doctrine of discovery has been used in United States Supreme Court cases in the last century. So this is really something that we know a lot of other Christian denominations have repudiated the doctrine of discovery. Many people have called on the Pope to rescind. However, that would probably set a bad precedent within the Catholic Church. So I'm not holding my breath that that will happen. However, it's important that we acknowledge it, that it really does set us on this path to genocide. And I still, have that question of what does colonial empire have to do with God? Why has the church aligned itself with the expansion of colonialism around the world? So when we look at what has happened to indigenous people in the United States, there are layers of trauma, not just, the trauma of Indian boarding schools, but starting with contact and exposure to diseases that we didn't have immunity to, which everyone now in the world knows what that feels like, and invasion of our lands, wars, massacres, and then signing treaties under duress to stop the war, to stop the killing of our people. And then even after we sign the treaties, continuing to have our lands stolen and to have those treaties broken. And even the government going so far as to try to terminate these sovereign nations. That is to say that they would no longer recognize them as sovereigns. All the way up to the self-determination era, after the Civil Rights Movement and the American Indian Movement, when a lot of legislation was passed to ensure our inherent rights, we still are fighting for those rights today. So layers upon generations of historical trauma for Indigenous people here in this country. This is a timeline of US Indian policy that you can find on our website from our publication called Healing Voices. And I'm not going to list everything in here, but you can see that, around the formation of this country, some of the legislation was called, the Indian Civilization Act, or the Indian Removal Act, even the Dead Indian Act. And then as you get further along into the more recent self-determination era, we have legislation called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act. Oh, sorry. Before that, we had the Indian Relocation Act and the Termination Policy. But now we have the Language Revitalization Act and the Indian Education Act. And so you see the difference in a lot of this legislation and how it is framed towards Native American people. The most important pieces of legislation to point out to you all regarding the boarding schools are the Indian Civilization Fund Act of 1819, which is an act that was authorized to administer the funds that were promised in the treaties in exchange for all the land that was ceded. And so this one is really important because so many people in this country think that Native people get welfare. But no, we do not receive welfare. We receive payment in perpetuity for the land that this country was built on. And so for those who call for the end to these payments, that's fine. They should just give the land back and they can stop the payments. However, even though the land was ceded and payments were promised, education, healthcare, and rations were also promised. It's interesting that the government chose to call the fund the Civilization Fund, that there was an agenda included with the administration of those funds. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created in 1824 under the Department of War to administer those funds. Now, that created a huge problem because the Department of War was the department that was used to dealing with Native Americans, but by way of removal or warring with them or trying to round them up to force them onto the reservation in which they were not allowed to leave. And so when these Indian agents who were military personnel were then told to administer rations and medicine and school books for the children, those people were filled with hatred because they had been told to kill the Indian. They had mottos like the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And so obviously there became a lot of corrupt Indian agents. In fact, the Dakota Wars, which led to the hanging of the Dakota 38+2, was because an Indian agent was not delivering rations during a winter blizzard and people were dying. And he told them, let them eat grass. And so a small war party set out to take the rations, and they found that Indian agent's body deceased with grass stuffed in his mouth. And so that racism was rampant throughout the beginning of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so by the 1860s, President Grant issued a peace policy in which two things happened. He said, one, we are now at peace with the Indian nations, and so we no longer have a need for peace treaties, which was not true. There were still Indian wars and massacres going on. But the other thing that he did through his peace policy was he allowed for churches to access those Indian civilization funds in response to the corruption with the Indian agents. And so that is how we ended up with federally funded church-run Indian boarding schools. And I've encountered a few schools who, you know, are looking into their history today, and they say, well, we never took federal money. And, you know, I've challenged them to look into their records, because the truth is that there was a big fight all over the country between denominations when they were able to access these funds. And they basically had to divvy up all of the reservations among the denominations and say, you know, who could proselytize where in order to access those federal funds. And so absolutely, the majority of those who were already missionizing and educating American Indians did take advantage of being able to access that funding. And so when we look at the history of Indian boarding schools, we start, for the coalition's research purposes, with the first federally funded off-reservation Indian boarding school, which was Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which opened in 1879. And then also for research purposes, we stop counting Indian boarding schools in the 1970s, when all of that legislation was enacted, which reversed the original policies of the United States to assimilate Native Americans. Instead of our languages being prohibited and our culture and religion being prohibited, the self-determination era protected our language and religious freedoms, so that schools that are still open today now promote language and culture. So we stopped counting around the 1970s, and we only consider what we call the historical assimilative model of Indian boarding schools when looking at this history. With that definition in mind, we have found over 367 Indian boarding schools that were operated in the United States. For comparison purposes, Canada had 139 residential schools in their country that were both operated by the government and by churches. So nearly 3 times the number in the United States. Canada found that over 100,000 children went to those schools. So you can either double or triple the numbers to estimate here in the United States. And over 6,000 died or went missing in Canada. And again, we probably have double or triple that in the United States. But the truth is, we don't know how many students went to these schools, and we don't know how many died or went missing, because we have never had a full accounting. The beginning of the boarding school era was definitely aimed at assimilation, where when children arrived, their clothes were taken from them. Any belongings from home, such as a blanket or a toy or a favorite item to remind them of their family, was taken and never to be seen again. We've heard accounts of those items being burned. The children's hair was cut, which for many tribal nations was a very significant ceremonious act, and hair was usually only cut during ceremony, either at the loss of a family member or due to great shame. And so the cutting of the hair against their will was also very traumatic. They were often deloused with harsh chemicals. In fact, some of the students went blind from being sprayed with lye. And then, of course, you know, we have reports such as the 1938 Merriam report that says, you know, most of these students were neglected or malnourished, in some cases beaten, starved, or otherwise abused. We also know that they were not receiving a quality education, and that half their day was spent learning how to be laborers and domestic servants, and that many of the students contributed to the running of the school, either by growing the food that they ate, sewing the uniforms that they wore, or even building the buildings at the schools. And Henry Pratt is the one who coined the term "kill the Indian, save the man." And he said, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Pratt thought he was doing the good Christian thing. He even wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses. What he did not realize was that he was creating a system of genocide, because all of these things have happened here in the United States and they meet the definition of genocide. And when Canada's commission called it cultural genocide, my argument is that cultural genocide is genocide. If it meets the definition, any of these definitions, then it is genocide. And we have had all of these in the United States, yet we have never faced the fact that we have had genocide in this country. And I can only find two books that refer to it this way. One is The American Holocaust by David Stannard, and the other is An American Genocide by Benjamin Madley. And so why are we not facing this history? We also at the Coalition like to point out that the Indian boarding schools were the first U.S. child Indian welfare policy of the United States. Despite the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, our children are still targeted for removal because the Bureau of Indian Affairs created the Indian Adoption Project after children from boarding schools were sent on summer outings to work and live with families for the summer, in which the schools received the wages. And they found that children assimilated quickly into those towns and societies. And so they realized it was more efficient than running these expensive boarding schools to just place them directly into white homes. And so they created the Indian Adoption Project. And today, no matter what county or state you pull the numbers from, Native American children are represented at higher rates per capita than any other ethnicity. So my family's boarding school history is that pictured on the right is my great-grandfather, John Willett, and he went to Carlisle Indian Boarding School. He was there from 1910 to 1915, and he played football with Jim Thorpe, but no one in my family told me that until I started asking questions about my grandfather's boarding school experience. And I was already working at the Coalition and trying to figure out what years my grandfather went to boarding school so I could pull his records. And so pictured on the left is my grandfather, Buddy Willett, and he went to Marty Catholic Indian School in South Dakota. And he also went to Haskell while it was a vocational school and had not yet become a university. So my grandfather wouldn't talk about what happened to him at boarding school. When I asked my mom and my aunts and uncles, they said he never wanted to talk about it. All he would say was he never wanted to step foot in the Catholic Church again, and that he almost missed my uncle's wedding because of that. And so no matter if it was, something negative, which is likely what happened to my grandfather, or something positive, like my great-grandfather playing football with Jim Thorpe, nobody talked about boarding schools in my family. And so this is also something that we need to address in our communities. We need to know these stories. We need to know what happened to our relatives. And as I've told this story to others around the country, one time a gentleman came up to me, an elder came up to me and said, I went to St. Paul's Marty Indian School. And he said he was there probably about 10 years after my grandfather. And he said that while he was there, they had this punishment called the belt line, in which the boys had to line up on two sides facing each other. And the boy being punished had to crawl through the middle on his hands and knees while the rest of them beat him with their belts as he crawled through. And if they didn't deliver a strong blow, then they would have to crawl through next and go through the belt line themselves. And so I just think about my grandfather and him as a little boy experiencing that. And I don't know what happened to my grandfather at boarding school. I just know that it definitely affected me. And so when I was doing my master's in leadership, I decided to write my thesis on Native American spirituality and Christianity, because I really felt this conflict of how can some people still be Christian and Native, knowing, I just had such a huge resentment against organized religion for all the atrocities that had been carried out in the name of God, and really didn't understand, So I did this research and found that there are a lot of people today who are Native and Christian, And there are plenty of people who want nothing to do with Christianity and have returned to their traditional ways. And there are also a lot more people in the middle who are blending to various degrees both of those theologies and finding synchronicity within the two religions. And though there are a lot of areas of compatibility with the two religious perspectives, the biggest area of conflict seemed to revolve around the role of spirits, angels, and demons. In fact, I interviewed a pastor of a Native American church who said that they don't allow the drum to be played because the belief that the drum has a spirit is demonic. And so really the conclusions that I came to were that the history of the church and Native Americans cannot be overlooked, and in fact must be addressed for the well-being and spiritual health of Native people, and that church leaders who continue to teach that Native American culture is non-biblical or evil may be perpetuating the cultural genocide and human rights violations of Indian boarding schools and other Christians who have criminalized Native religion, and that taking an active role in reconciliation and reparations as a spiritual leader can help heal generational trauma. One of the most interesting quotes that I found when I was doing my lit review is this from an anonymous speaker at a theological seminar. And they said, for Native peoples to follow Jesus, they can best do so not by becoming Christian, but by following their traditional ways. Any religion that is based on exclusivist notions of salvation necessarily becomes a religion tied to conquest and empire. So, as I mentioned before, that is a huge question that has yet to be answered. That the church has not, whatever denomination, but the church as a whole has not come to terms with their role in genocide and colonization around the world. And so for the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and talk about, we know now that this trauma that was experienced by children in these boarding schools is passed down through generations, and that kind of trauma interrupts a child's developing brain and wires it for a trauma response for the rest of their life. And the ACEs study showed that if a child had 4 or more of 10 identified ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, then they were more likely to suffer negative health outcomes as an adult, such as mental health illness, chemical dependency, but even heart disease and diabetes and early death. So when we think about all the issues that we are facing in our Native communities today with alcoholism and drug abuse, suicide, domestic violence, diabetes, early death, we have to remember that we didn't do that to ourselves, that those were not our traditional ways, and that we learned that in boarding school, and we learned that as a response to our trauma from boarding schools. And when you think about it that way, all the health and economic and education disparities that tribal nations face today are a direct result of the federal government's policies. So when we talk about healing historical trauma, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart has 4 steps that she lays out, which seems really simple, but it's not, because the first step is to confront the historical trauma. The second step is to understand it. The third step is to release that pain, to move through it. And then fourth, we can transcend and transform. But this country is not even at step 1. We are still not confronting the historical trauma in this country, and we certainly don't understand it. And so when we look at what has been happening this year, starting with the discovery of the unmarked graves in Canada and leading to some of the repatriations that were happening from Carlisle, and the introduction of an investigation from the Department of the Interior, we finally see that there's hope for access to justice for these crimes against humanity, for these crimes against our people in this country. And the Boarding School Healing Coalition has been doing this work for, as I mentioned, about a decade. And we've had many obstacles to doing the research, starting with when we asked the federal government for this information in 2016. through a FOIA request. The response was, we don't do research. Now we are working with the Department of the Interior and sharing the research that we had to go do independently. And when we've tried to get access to the records, we have been blocked by certain organizations. Obviously, the ones that are in the federal archives are open to the public and we can access those, but that's only about 32% of the records. And then the rest are being held in church archives, historical societies, universities, and so forth. And a few years ago, we had a grant proposal into the National Endowment for Humanities, and we were working with Marquette University to ask them if we could digitize the records there at Marquette. Marquette holds about 70 Catholic boarding schools records. And we had a really hard time getting them to agree that we weren't trying to get the records for a lawsuit, or that we weren't trying to do a smear campaign on the church. We simply wanted to get these records and make them accessible to the public with a digital copy, much like the Dickinson College digital archive of the Carlisle Indian boarding school. And reluctantly, they did sign a letter of support saying that they would support our digitization process if we won the grant, but that it would depend on permission from the donor. And after some more research and investigative work, we found out that the donor was the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions. So Father Sands, that's why I wanted to meet with you, but good thing I didn't come in person because I don't want to expose anyone to COVID. So we definitely still have some things to talk about in terms of the records being found in this country. Now that the Department of the Interior is investigating, they are, of course, looking at those federal records and asking non-governmental agencies such as churches and universities to make their records available. The federal government is focusing right now on finding the location of unmarked graves and burial sites. And the report is due to the secretary in April of 2022. So a very short timeline on this investigation. However, we still want to have a truth commission in this country. That's why the coalition was formed. And so last year we had worked with then Congresswoman Deb Haaland to introduce a bill for a truth commission. And it was an election year and it didn't get the attention it deserved. But this year, boarding schools are getting the attention that they deserved. And those children who died at those boarding school are finally getting the attention that they deserved. And so we were able to reintroduce the bill, a bipartisan bill. Senator Warren and Representative Davids and Representative Tom Cole introduced the bill for a Truth and Healing Commission. And so the commission will be a 5-year commission. If enacted, it will build on the investigation from the Interior. It will look into those church and government records, and it will hold public hearings so that we can hear from the survivors and the descendants directly. Now, in Canada, I did get to talk to the former commissioner, Chief Willie Littlechild, this summer and asked him for his input as we were drafting this bill. And he told me that they heard through the testimony that there were unmarked graves in many communities around those boarding schools in Canada. And so that 5-year commission in Canada, the report lists that there are unmarked graves. They knew that was discovered as part of the commission. The commissioners asked the Canadian government for funds to do the research to locate the unmarked graves, and the Canadian government said no to the funding. And so those communities had to go do that research on their own. And that's why it took 6 years after the commission for the discovery of those unmarked graves, the location of those unmarked graves to come forth. And so we absolutely must do that work here in the United States. We must have testimony. We must hold these hearings, not just examine the records, but hear from the people who experience these schools. We know of several locations here in the United States of unmarked graves. We've been working with several communities, including the Pine Ridge community, where the Red Cloud Indian School is still operating. And we know that many people want to voluntarily bring forth the records and voluntarily search for the unmarked graves. But it just depends on, it goes community by community. And so there is definitely a growing movement now of people being willing to pay attention to this history, to seek the truth and justice and healing that is so needed for generations of people. And we definitely know that we need everyone's help. And so your calls to action are to support the coalition with your political engagement and by spreading the word and sharing this information. We also have been calling for additional mental health resources for our communities. As we know, many survivors since June have been having a lot of their trauma resurface. And many of us, with the news of these unmarked graves, have felt very triggered, and that unresolved historical grief, that unresolved trauma has resurfaced. It will never go away until we confront it and resolve this history. And so I'm calling on all of you to join in these efforts for truth and healing, to do what you can to petition the government and the churches so that those records can be brought forth. The Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions definitely needs to examine their records and make them available to the communities that want access to those records, and to keep all of us survivors and descendants in your thoughts and prayers as we face this traumatic history. Thank you.
Thank you. Christine, thank you very much for those powerful words, for speaking this truth, and for all the incredible work that you're doing and the advocacy that's happening now in this country, and your leadership in making that happen. I invite now Father Sands to come up and share a little bit about his journey and his words and response to that. You want to come stand up here? That would be great. I'm going to see if I can unpin you so you don't have to be looking at you all the time.
Could you ask her if we could get access to that PowerPoint, David, because it was very hard to read some of the smaller print, and it was very helpful.
Yeah, Christine, they were asking about we just recorded that, but they were asking about the PowerPoint, if that's available for people to see.
I'm going to send a link to the Healing Voices publication, which has all of that information in it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Another question?
Right behind you.
There you go. You're stand so they can see you, and then you're fine. There you go.
And I don't want to be in the light of the projector. Okay.
Yeah, perfect, right there is great.
Definitely.
Here we go.
I'll share this also. Oh, okay.
Let's start this.
Yeah, I have some other things too, but
Hello, everybody. I'm Father Henry Sands, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions office in Washington. And first of all, I would like to acknowledge the Yakima people and to say that it's a blessing and honor to be here with all of you on the traditional land of the Yakima people. And I am Anishinaabe Ojibwe, and I'm from Kaffenong First Nation, which is just north of Detroit, and it's at the delta, the end of the St. Clair River. So the name of our community means where the waters divide. And I'm also an enrolled member of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians in Michigan. So this issue of the residential boarding schools is one that I have known about my entire life from my earliest recollections, because both of my mother's parents were taken away at the age of 4, taken from their families, and they grew up in schools, including through going to Carlisle Industrial Indian school. And so this issue has had a profound impact on my family, on the lives of my grandparents and their children, my generation, and the generation that follows us. And so I'm very grateful for the presentation of the history, a history I know well. I mean, it's been presented to us in a very complete and very well organized manner. It's a history I'm very familiar with. So I want to talk a little bit about my own personal experience, but before I do, just wanted to say that in terms of records that are stored for our organization at Marquette University, I know that there have been different people who have accessed those records. I don't know that I've been told that we don't have any ability to restrict access to the records. So I look forward to having a conversation about that. But also wanted to say that the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions never ran schools or administered schools. So I'm not even familiar with what information is there other than I myself did a search on the digitized information at the website of the Marquette University Archives. And there's information about schools. So I'll look forward to having a conversation about the records that are there. So having said that, just wanted to say that, the experience of my grandparents had a very negative effect on their lives. And I wanted to talk about how that affected their lives and the lives of their children, and then some of my cousins from my own generation. My grandparents married, and they decided to raise their family not on a reservation because they didn't want to have the same things that happened to them happen to their children. They didn't teach their children the language, and they had 10 children. My grandparents both died at a young age. My grandmother died at the age of 44. She had breast cancer and tuberculosis. And my grandfather died at the age of 51. My grandfather was a policeman in the city of Detroit, and he experienced a head injury. And my mother said that after that happened, that he was very different. He was very violent, and my grandparents ended up separating because of that. And so my grandparents both, lived at they died at a relatively young age, and I really attribute it to their experiences in the boarding schools. They both came from families that were very solid, upright, industrious. They were farmers. They were leaders in their community, and my grandparents were taken away from their families, and they came from extended family that was very close, very large, so it was a great tragedy. And my mother and her siblings, most of them experienced death at a relatively young age, and also difficulties with substance abuse or with alcoholism, and I really attribute that to, the trauma of my grandparents being in the schools, and, the difficulties that my grandparents experienced in their own lives that then passed on to my mother's generation. As I said, a few of my uncles and aunts died at an early age because of alcoholism. One of my uncles was homeless, living on the cities of Detroit, and he froze to death one winter. One of my aunts died because of the effects of alcoholism and drug abuse. And my mother's youngest sister, we never met. My mother's siblings were all taken away to foster homes when their mother died. So you could say that, that they also had to live the same kind of life that their parents did, growing up away from their family, away from their siblings in non-native homes. So this whole system had a really very, very, very disastrous, detrimental effect on the lives of my family. And then in my own generation, a lot of my own cousins, carry the trauma, they carry the wounds, and they have also had to deal with depression, substance abuse, alcoholism, suicide, all those kind of things. And I think that, this story could be told by many, many Native people. What I'm talking about, I believe, really resonates among all of us. So I have wanted, to see this issue addressed, and I'm really glad that there are organizations that have been around for 10 years, for example, as we just heard. And, the attention is now being given to the issue. I'm really hoping will bring about some positive change. I am participating in some efforts to support the efforts of the Department of the Interior and also within the Catholic Church of South, that there are different parts of the Catholic Church that are wanting to address the issue. So I'm going to do my very best, to bring it to the forefront. I think a lot of people don't know much about Native Americans in general. Most people don't know anything about this residential boarding school, nor any of the other injustices that are part of all the different policies of the U.S. government that we've heard about. And so this is I hope it's an opportunity to educate people about this very difficult history that is a part of the history of everybody who lives in North America. And I'm really hoping that there'll be some good positive changes that come about. I'm just checking my time. So I'm looking forward to just collaborating with people going forward to address the issue. It's been, as I said, on my heart and my mind for the entirety of my life. And for most of my life, there was not much attention being paid to it. I haven't had that many opportunities to speak to people about it until the last year, really. But I'm glad that it's now being addressed, and I'm really looking forward to change. I would like to see some efforts at bringing about an acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. I'd like to see some things happen that will acknowledge that my grandparents and so many other people were, so horribly treated, and that their lives are really ruined because being taken away to these schools. And so I look forward to continuing to address the issue, and I look forward to having the opportunity to collaborate with people who are working on this issue very, very intentionally and dedicating their lives to trying to help to bring about the right kind of response to it. So I think that's all I'm going to share right now.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce the Reverend David Bell, who's from the Yakama Christian Mission, and he can tell us the title of his program with the Disciples Church, and there he goes.
Thank you, David. And David, if you let me know when my time is up, if I go too far. So it's wonderful to be here with you all today and to have this chance to have this conversation, this very needed conversation in this particular place. It matters a lot. Again, my name's David Bell, and my title is Minister for Indigenous Justice with Yakama Christian Mission, and a new organization that's coming together is Center for Indigenous Ministries within the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. My home landscape for the last 20 years plus has been the Yakama Nation, and being in this place where the Yakama Mission got started long ago. And I should say that I'm a settler descendant, unlike last two speakers, that my folks have been here for since the first birth that we know of is in 1772. And that time, I think what's important in saying that is to recognize that my people have been those colonist settlers during all of that time. So when we talk about the damage that has been put upon the indigenous landscape and the indigenous peoples of this landscape, is that my people have been a part of that through the lenses of what this colonist settler nation has done. And so this damage comes across in many ways, and the differences is so much is that my indigenous kin die from this colonist settler state that we've been a part of. Well, on the other hand, my kin, direct kin who are settler descendants benefited from it. And I think it's important to say that and acknowledge that as we get started in this, and because it becomes important because of who I represent talking about this. In part, what I'm going to do is take a little bit of time because my piece is tied directly to this place that we're in today, the Yakama Nation, and recognize how I came to be a part of this, which I think is a part of what Christina has talked about in making this so important. I think first we need to remember that when she talked about those Indian wars and what went on there, is to remember the Treaty of 1855, of what we heard in the very beginning in our land recognition. And out of that, 5 years later, is that we have the Fort Simcoe boarding school that comes together here on the reservation at Fort Simcoe, and does exactly what we've heard of taking children away from their parents and cutting hair, changing names, and changing clothing. It's recognizing something very particular went on there in a way that was damaging and hurtful. The reason to look at that from my perspective, when we look from what I'm talking about, is that boarding school closes down around 1917. That's about the time my people in my denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, starts looking around, and by 1919 organizes to put together a mission to the Yakama people, totally based on the idea that Fort Simcoe boarding school had closed down. And so in 1921, the American TB Christian Mission opens. So that organization at that time is the predecessor of what I became a director of in 1999, the Yakama Christian Mission. When that comes in, that organization is held in fairly good regard because it wasn't a boarding school, because it was identified as a Christian home, that no one's hair was cut, no clothing was, you didn't have to wear different clothing, and you didn't get a new name. But here's what becomes critical in understanding what the American TB Christian Mission was about in that day, and why that sounds good, why it's problematic. And so when I look at this, it's good for me to say that when I approach this, I approach it a little different than Christine, because in defining how boarding schools are defined. And so I'm in a different place. I don't have to tie it so tightly. In that particular era, in 1921, there's one foundational thing that's happening on the reservation, and that is that we have a public boarding school in place. So when disciples come in and start the American TB Christian Mission, they don't start a boarding school because you have a public boarding school in place, which the Indian Commissioner, the previous Indian Commissioner, had really encouraged to have Native students to go to public schools, with the whole idea that their white peers might overwhelm them. When disciples come in and start a Christian home and have young Indian people come there and live there away from their parents, to be Christianized and to be civilized in a very particular way, while the children go back and forth to the public school, is that to say that disciples came in a different era than what we talk about that got put together under the Grant administration. And by coming in a different era, they continue the same process of moving children away from the parents in a very intentional way. And so while our history comes down different than the boarding school, I would say that the history is exactly the same. It just enters into a different era. Why do I think this is important? Is because when we start recognizing that boarding schools were a very particular piece in our history, is this idea of the history, as Christina gave us, is as you move down that timeline, it keeps changing and moving. And so when we look at the acts that go in place, each one plays in a different way in a different era. When we recognize that, then it becomes incumbent upon all of us today to recognize that even now, the damage to the Indigenous landscape is continuing, and the damage to Indigenous people is continuing. Just because it doesn't have boarding school in its name today doesn't mean that the acts that come along, the way the government is playing this out, isn't going on in a particular and meaningful way. Now, for us, or for me, I should say, but for the Yakama Christian Mission and the Center for Indigenous Ministries, what this means is to say we need to do something different. So disciples, like many other Christian denominations, repudiated the doctrine of discovery, and we did this in 2017. But we also recognize this, as repudiation of the doctrine is meaningless for Christian organizations if action is not tied to it. And so that's what becomes very important, is that I believe that there must be reparative and restorative work, and that work needs to happen now by all Christian institutions in the United States and Canada. And for the Center of Indigenous Ministries, the primary thing that we are starting is to say that within at least the denomination that started this Christian home in 1921, is that there must be a truth and healing council that meets throughout the United States and Canada, because that's the framework of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and that needs to be done in every area, and that voices, Indigenous voices, need to be heard, and out of that, actions need to be taken. And so that becomes a foundational piece of what we are working on today, is to move into a time that calls for intentional listening, so that restorative and reparative work can begin, and that healing can be a part of who we are. And so I'll leave it at that, David, and leave it open to where we need to go next.
Great.
Thank you for allowing me to have this time.
Thank you very much, David. So I'm gonna invite Maxine up here. I'm gonna try to pin each of you so that we can get you all on the screen at the same time. There. Oh, I did it. Look at that. All right, there you go. Father Sands comes back, you can
go off a little bit. Thank you, David, for the opportunity to come before this body and talk about the boarding school experience. It's a pleasure to meet all of you who are my colleagues online, but Christine, Thank you for your comments. David, thank you as well. And Father Sands, he just stepped out for a minute, but thank him. What I want to say is before we open for comment, you know, I used, Christine, I used your Truth in Healing document in my class as I taught the Indigenous experience in one of my classes. And so it's a tool that I use routinely. So thank you for that. But I do want to share a little personal story. You know, as we look at those timelines that you shared with us, Christine, I'm a product of those timelines. I attended boarding school for 8 years. It was at the time called Holy Rosary Mission, which is now Red Cloud Indian School. I spent 8 years there. I also spent 4 years at a Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school. And so I know the trajectory of those timelines and the impacts that it has had on people. You know, the timeline, the intergenerational trauma that has permeated throughout Indian country, I see and feel that throughout in my journey as I work with Indian people, Native people. I'm a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe from the Pine Ridge Reservation. My name is Maxine Bringsenback Janice. I'm Oglala Lakota, as I said. And I, you know, make my home here on the homelands of the Yakama Nation. But this conversation is something that just, you know, touches the heart. You know, sharing these experiences with students that oftentimes have not had an exposure or an awareness to this conversation has been, as we create that awareness at our institution, has been very impactful. Students, you know, see the challenges that we've had to face as Indian people, as Indigenous people. So I just wanted to share some comments before we open it up for questions and you know, have some dialogue related to this conversation. So David, questions, how would you, I'm open to take questions directed toward our speakers and or just comments as well. So I can control the conversation in the room. I can't control the conversation that's on the Zoom platform. So maybe we'll start with conversations from the room here or comments.
Yeah, and if people do want to unmute and ask a question, you can do that as well. And I can also try to read some things from the chat if you want to put something in the chat.
Do you have any comments or questions related to, for the speakers, or just, you know, your thoughts? I think it would be great to hear your voices in the room here.
Thank you. Hello, thank you, Maxine. I don't think people can see me, but on Zoom, but I can hear me, right? My name is Andrew Sund. I'm the president of Heritage University, and I really just like to thank all three speakers for giving this very honest accounts of how you interpret this very difficult history. I don't really have a question except to say that I'm deeply moved by the testimonies we've heard today. And I really would like to welcome you, all three of you, to Heritage University. And I hope that this is the beginning of many dialogues that we will continue to have in this university, because this university's history is tied to the histories that have been told today in indirect ways, but we are in the Yakama Nation, and in that way we are connected. So really just a thank you to all speakers for participating today and for being willing to share these difficult histories. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I have a question. I'm in the Zoom room. I want to thank all of you for presenting today and for speaking truth in this space. And I'm a historian. I write about the Yakima Reservation and the different groups of people, immigrants and settlers, that are interacting with and impacting the lives of Indigenous people in this region. And I come across a lot of mentions of the boarding school, the children, some of the things, Christine, that you talked about regarding punishment. Those are things that I see in the archives all the time. So it's a very sobering conversation. So I appreciate all of you sharing. I do have a question about what you three leaders might envision that Heritage University can specifically do to support the conciliation or reconciliation, especially as we serve students actively at our university. Like, what are some real tangible ways for us to support students more fully to build the equity that has been lost because of the slippages of boarding school and all of the other historical trauma that we've created around Indigenous people? Thank you.
I can answer that.
He wants to respond.
So we have somebody,
Who's on the microphone?
Michael, come over here. Mike wants to respond, but also any of the three that are on there, please respond to that.
Who's that?
That was Yesenia. That was
Yesenia?
Oh, thank you.
History teacher here. Oh, again, my name is Michael Buck. This is a really difficult conversation to have. I could feel it. I could feel it here. And I could feel people's feelings and uneasiness. But I am, like I said earlier, a student from Heritage University, and I just recently graduated in 2019. And one of my mentors and advisors was Dr. Alexiadis. And one of the first courses I took here at Heritage was Inland Fisheries Management. One of the most moving experiences I've ever had at Heritage University was when Dr. Alexiadis invited Atwai, deceased Dr. Russell Jim, into our classroom. It's hard to put into words, but Dr. Jim brought children's handcuffs and that he had kept in his possession, in his family's possession. He spoke about being hidden by his parents and about his siblings being taken. And it was a very strange moment to be caught up in. We forgot we were in class. He had a way of speaking that was, it made you forget where you were at. And he was right here on campus speaking to native and non-native fisheries students. But the way he spoke had some kind of impact on you. And the way he told the history of this land here was phenomenal. And how he overcame it through teaching and promoting education and his willingness to share his story in a good way. And I don't want to take too much time, but in all honesty, the non-native students were silent the whole time he was speaking. And those students I remember that were non-native, they were in tears after he was done speaking. Just to for him to hold up those children's handcuffs and to speak about overcoming through adversaries, you know, and getting back to traditional ways and being honored here at Heritage and be willing, like I said, to speak on behalf of these tough subjects was courageous of him. And he was a soft-spoken person. He's one of my greatest mentors. You know, I do remember that day. A lot of students, every single student shook his hand, and there was 2 or 3 students that were in tears, and they gave him a hug. And I just wanted to acknowledge Dr. Rexiatis on multiple occasions. He's brought elders of the Yakama Nation to fisheries courses, to labs, and I know other professors that have done the same. And I don't believe that, I believe that there's a really great relationship between Heritage and Yakama Nation. You know, the teepee, the land acknowledgement, and the multiple denominations, and you know, being able to ring the bell, and the staff and faculty are fully aware of that ongoing trust and relationship building. So, you know, I just wanted to thank the different people that made that happen for elders of the Yakama Nation to be here and to honor him with a doctorate degree, because I witnessed firsthand the impact that he made here. So those are some of the things that I witnessed.
Thank you,
Thank you
Michael.
for that.
Comments. Would the panelists like to respond beyond that? Steve, Maurice Sands, David?
I'm willing to give it a bit that Yesenia. I think that one, I would like to say that a student shouldn't be able to get out of Heritage without a clear understanding of the doctrine of discovery and understanding what that is, how that's impacted the Yakima landscape directly, the Yakima people, the plants, the water, certainly the salmon. It's I think that's a critical piece because of who Heritage is and where Heritage is at. And I think that I think it would go a long way to that within the institution itself, that students come together and take a look, perhaps over years, but a close look at the governing documents of the institution itself, and with asking the question of how are those governing documents accountable to the Yakima landscape? And when I say landscape, I do mean the people, but I mean the plants and the soil and the animals, the fish, that which has culturally mattered to that landscape. So that, I mean, that's a little bit of how I would think of it.
Yeah, so I just dropped a link in the chat. We have a free curriculum online. It's pretty brief, you know, it's for elementary, middle school, and high school. And so I recognize, you know, as a higher education institution, it may not meet your requirements, but we wanted to target K through 12 because this history isn't told in this country. Of all the states that have American Indian education standards, only 4 of them include the boarding school history. So that's definitely one thing, you know, in terms of truth and healing, or truth and reconciliation, whatever you decide to call it, it starts with the truth, which means that we need to be educating people about this history and exploring it fully, not just, you know, nationally, internationally, but what it means for individual communities and institutions and their specific histories and involvement with this legacy. Also, I would say that, the term reconciliation is a controversial term. It's not an indigenous term. It's a colonial term. It's a biblical term. And we don't use that term here in the United States and in our work because there is no consensus on what reconciliation means. So, you could have one whole conversation about just, the word reconciliation. So I would definitely say, it begins with the truth, and you could use Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart's framework of, dealing with that historical trauma to move through that in confronting the history and understanding it as the first two steps. And then, of course, with all of these things, it depends on, what the indigenous voices have to say. In all of this work, it's about reversing the narrative of subjugation in this country and instead lifting up those indigenous voices and letting them be the ones to say what reconciliation or healing looks like.
I don't have a lot of comments to make because I'm not from here, and this is the first time I've been to Heritage, but I would say that education is really important. It's a very important first step. There is a lot, as I said earlier, a lot that people don't know about Native Americans. Hardly anybody knows about the residential boarding school policy and the impact that it's had on Native people. And people don't know anything about all the other policies that Charlene outlined for us. So, building that into the curriculum here at Heritage in whatever place, that you could do that, I think that would be a very, very good thing to do. And also in your efforts to deal with social issues and your issues in whatever you do to try to help people who are in need, people who are wounded by injustice and by prejudice, racism, discrimination, those kind of things. So in whatever way those kinds of issues are addressed here at the university, to make sure that addressing the injustices that Native people here have been subject to for such a long time. It's very relevant to this community because you're located on the Yakama Nation, and the people that surround you, have had to live through all of these things, and many of the students as well. So I think that, building into your education programs and also building into your dealing with social issues, helping people in need would be great first steps for the university to undertake.
Thank you.
We have Sister Kathleen who wanted to offer some comment or question. Then we have Saul and then Greg Pierce.
Thank you, Maxine. Well, I want to say, first of all, how much I appreciate the comments and sharing by each of the three key speakers, Maxine also. I think the careful portrayal of your experiences and sharing with us makes a big difference. The thought that I wanted to share, and then if anyone wanted to respond, would fine. I'm thinking that one of the reasons that this issue is so difficult for the dominant culture and gets ignored is that I think there's an unspoken, I guess you could call it cultural rule of thumb in the dominant culture, that if something really bad has happened to you, you never talk about it. And it's not just the issues we're talking about today, but for instance, if you had a sibling who committed suicide, you wouldn't share that even with friends that you got very close to. If you suffered from sexual abuse in your home from one way or another, the standard is you just don't talk about that. And so, and that's not, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's the way that we're enculturated to think. So then to turn to the kind of pain and suffering that we're talking about, which is so important to recognize and be able to accept that we need to talk about it. We need to see what the truth was and then move together to healing. That is a very difficult process for a typical person, I think, in our culture. At least that's my perception because of this unspoken rule that pretty much dominates.
Are there any responses from the panelists related to Sister Kathleen's comment? Okay, I'm going to go to Saul. You had a question, Dr. Neely?
Sio Nagad, my name is Saul Neely. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm really grateful for you to be here. I am relatively new to Heritage University. This is my second year. I come from University of Alaska Southeast, where I taught for 11 years on Shingarani. I really value the discussion here, and I don't know what kind of question I have, because when I'm at the tip of articulating questions or concerns, I get frustrated because I don't think non-Native people really put their money where their mouth is when it comes to these issues. I think we have to understand that the boarding schools were created not to bring an end to the warfare against Native people in this country, but to extend it. Boarding schools were an extension of war. They were not a cessation of war. And those attitudes are still with us today. My good friend, One Lance Twitchell, who's Tlingit, he came into my office one day when I was in Juneau, and he said, they beat our languages out of us and replace them with languages that hate us. And you think about how powerful that phrase is, a language that hates us, how it really gets at the very inner contours of your sense of self, and it stays there and it's passed down through the epigenetic DNA. We know all of this, you all were talking about it. And I think about Frantz Fanon in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, and a decolonial classic. And one of the arguments that's been made about the title he gave that book in French, Le Dame de la Terre, was that this notion of the damned, or what gets translated as the wretched of the earth, has its etymology in the word donner, the French word donner, meaning to give, which means that settler colonialists didn't see Native people as bearing any kind of gift-giving capacity. We were the people who couldn't give. And I think about this even at Heritage University, because our university system, the university as a historically white supremacist institution, carries with it that legacy, the boarding school. And we have to be really careful that even Heritage University doesn't seem like an extension of the boarding school. And I think sometimes it does. And when I want to talk about this, I get very quickly told that we're doing good things, that we've done good things. And very quickly, we move toward these settler moves to innocence. And it gets so frustrating because I hear Native students in my own classrooms telling me how they feel. I've seen the data. Just this past week, I got some data, and it looks at different demographics at Heritage University, who starts their career at Heritage University and who goes on to finish. Most of our demographic groups are in the 70 to 80% chance, or 70 to 80% range of finishing all the way through. But our Native students have 50%. So like, just as the last thing I'll say, I'm sort of like, in response to Yesenia's question, what can we do? There's all sorts of things we can do, and they don't necessarily have to be big, grand things either. They can be the little things like responding to the needs. of our faculty members when we say, this is what we're seeing in the classroom, this is what we need. So excuse me if I don't have a question. I have a comment that's born out of a little bit of frustration, but full of gratitude to our speakers. I'm so grateful that you do bring the truth out. I just hope it sticks longer than these 2 hours that we're together today or this week.
So, I believe, Christine, were you going to respond in some way to Dr. Lilly's remarks?
Yes. Thank you, Saul Chimigwich, for speaking up and for speaking from your heart and for voicing those frustrations and realities that you are facing. I actually am a doctoral student right now at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And when I decided to go get my PhD, I really struggled with a lot of other Indigenous PhD folks telling me that it was going to be one of the most traumatic things I ever did because entering the academy, the institution that was, set up on this basis of white supremacy is very triggering for Indigenous people. And so I think you're really speaking to something that can be addressed at Heritage University and, at other institutions across the country. These institutions were not built for us. And so how can we decolonize and support our Indigenous students within these, colonial frameworks? I don't have an answer. That was a rhetorical question. So, but the fact that you're speaking to it, I think, is the beginning of the conversation. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure. Thank you very much, Saul. That all of us are Native, we have to live in another world and live and work and function in institutions that are not too welcoming to us. That's been the experience of my life. And so in different ways where I can identify a way to speak out or where I can identify some way to make a difference, I've been doing that. And we have to work with the institutions and the organizations as they are, and so it's really slow work, and it's also it's a work that hasn't been undertaken a lot, and I would say that it's the kind of work that is relatively new, so that anybody that wants to engage with the system, to engage with institutions, to speak out on our behalf, we're pioneers, and it's always really, really hard to be a pioneer, and sometimes it's really hard to see the progress. But today, I was taken on a tour of this place, and I was shown all of the pictures and stories about all of the elders who have been honored here at this university. Tomorrow, there will be honoring 8 elders. Is that correct? Yes. 8, yes. And I was very inspired by those stories, because those are people who were pioneers. Those are people who were bold and courageous. Those are people who made sacrifices and worked really hard on their own behalf and on the behalf of their peoples. And through those efforts, they really brought about really positive, good change. And so we have lots of role models that we can look to, and we need to look at role models. This is a new area that we're trying to address, and because a lot of attention has come to this issue in the last year, I hope that there will be a lot of people that will engage with this issue very, very concretely, with lots of determination, with lots of passion. I would say that those words apply to you, Christine, and I hope that I can join you in some ways in that effort. So, we need to have hope as we look at these things, and we need to speak up. I've had many experiences of speaking up. Sometimes I've done it without realizing the implications of what I'm saying, and I've been surprised at the pushback or the resistance. But sometimes I've thought it through and have brought things forward. So I'm very glad that there are many people that are willing to engage in dealing with issues such as the residential boarding schools and the huge injustice that it is, and it's one that has been around for such a long time, along with so many other policies of the government that have so negatively impacted us. And I'm just glad to see people like Christine and some of the others who are engaging in these battles. So I would say, Sol, keep up the good fight, keep speaking out, and believe that your efforts will make a difference, and it's going to make a difference for the Native students here. It's going to make a difference for all of us, because the more that we're able to live together in peace and live as one, I mean, it's better for all of us. So thank you for your words.
And Saul, I'll keep it short. I think what becomes critically important is to recognize that, of course, you're within an institution that is, its foundation is settler, and it was built to bring to that our institutions that we are part of that colonist base that this nation put together, and that what we have to recognize is that there's a clear difference between intent and impact. And so the intent of the institution, I think, of Heritage University is great. But what you're talking about is the impact. And there's two, and it comes the two radically different pieces. And that's why, for me, as I said earlier, is that to look at institutional documents, especially governing documents, in a way that are they accountable to the Indigenous voice? Because that is, to me, is a foundational way of moving towards change. Whether it can be solid or not depends if folks are willing to change those documents so that they do become accountable.
Thank you, David and Christine and Father Sands. I believe Greg has a comment or a question. You have your hand up, Greg.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you, Maxine, and thank you to each of you, Christine, and everyone who presented tonight. Is very powerful and moving. I did put a question in there that is just kind of related to addressing how many of you might have, in many instances, worked with or worked around people who just seem to deny the truth or history, or the gaps there are among us in this nation are so wide on many of these issues. And so I guess that's one question. And a second question that I have is, as a non-Native faculty member myself at Heritage, I often feel very challenged by how I can enter into space and conversation about some of these topics, not being Native and not feeling that I have the right or ability to provide any input or ask questions, because I want to maintain the respectful space and listening to how I can help in ways. So I guess, there's there's two different fraught questions and ideas that I'm asking about, and I don't know if there's any time for those, but I just wanted to thank you all. So
Yeah, thank you, Gregory. I think, yes, it is a complicated question, but definitely, some of the most helpful white allies that I've worked with over the years have been ones that absolutely see it from an Indigenous perspective and echo those narratives. At any point, if, people try to explain away or, rush towards absolution, then, that is continuing the harm of, the genocidal era of boarding schools. And so I think you can, as a non-Native person, speak to this issue, especially to other white people.
Mhm.
And so that's where you need to start, listening to Native people, hearing their perspective, wrapping your head around the history and our stories, and making sure that you educate other Native people to do the same.
Thank you.
Do we have any other comments from or questions from the participants on Zoom?
And translation is that my name is Lakaiski Yawa Shakshnai, that means the light within shines outwardly. And to answer that one question about how do we decolonize, well, I always joked around about it and said, just learning language. And then, because, I'm always attacked when they say, you're a Christian? I'm like, yeah, I'm a believer of Christ. I believe in Jesus. I pray to God. But I also pray to Taman with love. And the Creator has many names. And I was taught by my grandmother to respect all religion. So I go to the Loghouse and to the Shaker Church, like practice the Sweat Lodge, and also go to the Shiapa Church. And I also went to Nazarene University, Nazarene Indian Bible College, and got my bachelor's in biblical studies. But what I've learned since I've been here on the Yakama Reservation and went on sabbatical leave for my master's program was the courage to heal, and healing our spirit would require us to speak up and no hold bars, and to be truthful no matter how much it hurts. Because I always tell everybody that my mom was the last generation to be forcefully taken from her mom, far away in the middle of the United States to go to boarding school. And my dad told me stories about what happened to him when he went to boarding school. And he would get beat up for speaking his language, and he would run away and go home. And so when I asked to go to boarding school, my mom said, no. And when I tried to talk to my grandmothers in my language, they just looked away from me because I didn't know of all this boarding school history until when they start finding all these bodies and it was on the national news. But that's how I see how the higher education institution can help. It is providing well, maybe, because I'm getting my master's, I was working for it, my master's in clinical counseling. So that maybe Heritage could lead that program here, because I don't know if they have that or anything like that here. But I know counseling does work, group therapy does work. I go to Celebrate Recovery. I used to go to AA and NA. Sometimes I go to that, but I believe that to bring more people in to share their stories, the ones that are still alive today, interview those people. The traditional knowledge, that's, you don't hear that in all the higher education institutions, and people are getting their doctorates in traditional knowledge. And natives, that they're looking for natives to come to school for traditional ecological knowledge, because there's still natives across the United States and up in Canada that still practice their old ways that were passed on from generation to generation. And I understand the land, what he's talking about, the damage to the land. We're still fighting for those rights to go root digging on our ceded land. And we're seeing too many more people up there in the mountains where we pick our huckleberries, when we used to never see non-natives up there ever, when I was a child and growing up. And last year was the first time I saw the most non-natives up there in my huckleberry fields where I picked. The first time. And I was wondering where the elders were, because the elders would have kicked them out and said, this is for Indians only. And yeah, to this day, even when the Supremists took over the Burns museum over there in the Paiute land down in Oregon, they were trying to kick us off our ceded land for digging roots, and I was with 3 elders. They had 3 cop cars there ready to take us in when we came out of the ceded land. So I understand what you guys are talking about. We're still fighting today. And they institutionalize us to keep us quiet. Send us to the loony bin or jail. This is a painful subject to talk about, and I almost started crying. But that's, I'm still learning, and I think that we're very grateful that they're finally getting the language program, not only in college, but also like in grade school, because we barely had that.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, you have something to close us with?
Yeah. So I just want to thank you all for participating in this conversation. For many of us, Indigenous people, this is the essence of trauma that we experience in our lives. And boarding school, for many, is a conversation that we don't want to have. It's around, language lost. It's around things that we don't want to talk about oftentimes. And as I shared with you, I've had these experiences, but it's a story that, oftentimes I don't share with anyone. So as we close this evening, I would like to thank, of course, Dr. Sun for, supporting the work that we do here around Indigenous initiatives. I want to acknowledge that. I hear, Saul, your frustration. Christine, I hear your frustration that working on a doctoral degree and the tensions you feel. I felt those same tensions, that I couldn't fit this round peg in a square hole. I experienced that. I mean, and so, it goes very deep. I mean, we're talking about boarding school, but it goes much deeper than that. And so in closing, I would like to offer a closing prayer in my Lakota language. And I pray for each and every one of you. I experienced tension. Was baptized a Catholic, but I spent my years in with my traditional family and traditional ways of knowing. And so I had those experiences of where do I stand in this religion spectrum, that we have in our society. And I finally, in my I won't say my age, but in my wisdom years, I come to realize that my relationship is with the Creator. And that's where I stand in my spiritual journey. And so that being said, I'd like to offer a blessing to each and every one of you for participating in this conversation, in this dialogue that we've had this evening, joining us during Spirituality Week as we do this difficult work. And if you could all join me in just bowing your heads. And as I speak in my Lakota language, I lift each and every one of you up and ask the Creator to touch your heart and bless you as you journey through this earth, walking forward. Chokata ke maoni te ke ohinya uki sakip mania hechums elewa chewakia. Nantente washte hechums omani unchunks chaonki apetum kashla. Zania unchunks. Chehechums elewa chunkyaks. Na you halal yankoglana. The chums ewonglakona. Washuchu oyate unspeb hecha. Ahoch unkish unkunks. Now I don't want to hechums Unkinap hap ash heda unshilaka bet from Kashloa Kantaka. Na chokata kyang de ke ohinya unkisaki maniye hechums elewa chewakia. Ha mitakayasi. All my relations. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Maxine. Thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. Thank you for all of our panelists for being with us and all those folks online. This has been a powerful time together. And I remember watching Cornel West in this movie called Examined Life, in which he's talking this deeply profound vision of his own life and his calling in life and the work that he has to do. And then he gets out of the cab and goes on to the next thing. And so we are ending this conversation now, but this work continues on. And I hope that pray that we can all continue on this journey together. Thank you all.